Greetings, dear subscribers and casual listeners of my channel. Today, we're diving into the most voluminous book in the Harry Potter series, The Order of the Phoenix. Its 832 pages gave J.K. Rowling the freedom for incredible storylines, but also for some glaring mistakes. Let's go through the plot holes and inconsistencies that can be found within this story. Enjoy watching. Number 1. Hermione and the House Elves. After the events of Goblet of Fire, Hermione becomes almost obsessed with the idea of freeing house elves. She starts knitting socks, hats and scarves, leaving them around the Gryffindor common room, hoping the elves will take the clothes and gain their freedom. However, the effect turns out to be the opposite. The elves take offense and stop coming there altogether, leaving only Dobby to do the cleaning. But here's the big question: does it even work that way? In Chamber of Secrets, it's made very clear that a house elf can only be freed by their owner. Hermione had no authority over them, and even if we suppose the elves might think Dumbledore had left the clothing, such logic would completely undermine the very concept of elf servitude. By that reasoning, any sock lying around a house could become a freedom trigger. This system wouldn't have lasted very long. Number 2. Prefect powers. One of the contentious moments in the book is the scene where Draco Malfoy, having already joined Umbridge's inquisitorial squad, deducts points from Gryffindor and Hufflepuff for speaking badly about a teacher. Ernie Macmillan protests, saying that prefects don't have the right to take points. However, in Chamber of Secrets we see the opposite. Percy Weasley takes points from his own house after catching Ron in the second-floor bathroom. So, prefects did have that power, but then another problem arises. Who exactly oversaw this process? Could Malfoy just, on a whim, take 100 points from Gryffindor, and were the reasons and timing of these deductions recorded anywhere? Number 3. The hearing. Harry's trial teeters on the brink of disaster. He barely makes it on time, but Arthur Weasley manages to get him there. At the hearing, the Wizengamot charges Harry with 2 offences: underage use of magic and performing magic in the presence of a Muggle, but that second charge seems shaky. The Muggle in question was already well aware of the wizarding world. It was Dudley who had already seen Dementors. That means Dudley's presence didn't actually violate the statute of secrecy. So it seems the judges didn't bother much with fact-checking. Number 4. The trace. At the start of the book, we get a vivid scene. Dementors attack Harry, and Dudley Harry casts a patronus and suddenly faces the threat of expulsion from Hogwarts. Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia lock him in his room, just like in Chamber of Secrets. The Order of the Phoenix comes to the rescue. But here's the logical snag. The trace is placed on the location where an underage wizard lives if there are no adult witches or wizards nearby. That means the Ministry should have detected the Lumos spell, the packing charms, and the cleaning spells Tonks used. Yet somehow those cases were ignored, and only Harry was punished. Number 5. The Department of Mysteries. Midway through the book, we learn that members of the Order of the Phoenix take turns guarding the prophecy in the Department of Mysteries. It's there that Arthur Weasley is attacked by Nagini. You'd think the security would be airtight, yet in the finale, Death Eaters manage to get inside without much trouble. What's more, members of the Order arrive noticeably late, leaving Harry and his friends alone in extreme danger. It works for the drama, but not for the logic. Number 6. Dennis Creevey. Colin Creevey's younger brother first appears in Goblet of Fire, and has been trying to follow in his brother's footsteps ever since. When sorted, he ends up in Gryffindor, and during the first year's boat ride across the Black Lake, he manages to fall into the water. Later we see him at the Hog's Head during the Dumbledore's army meeting. But at that moment, Dennis is only a second year, meaning he didn't have the right to visit Hogsmeade, so either he broke the rules or the author simply overlooked this detail. Number 7. Flight on Thestrals. The night was cool and heavy with mist as Luna stroked the skeletal neck of a Thestral. Harry could see the creature clearly, its leathery wings twitching in anticipation. Neville too watched with quiet familiarity. But behind them, Ron and Hermione shifted uncertainly, staring into empty air. "Just grab on," Harry urged. Hermione's hand hesitated before closing around what to her was nothing but space. Moments later, she was seated on an invisible back, clutching an invisible mane. This is where the logic falters. The books establish that Thestrals can only be seen by those who have witnessed death and understood it. For Luna, Harry, and Neville, this was no obstacle. But for Ron and Hermione, who had not yet met that requirement, the act of mounting and flying such a creature should have been a blind gamble. No clear instructions, no visible frame to aim for, and yet they take off into the sky as though riding a well-trained broom. The story never explains how a person can so confidently ride something they can't even see. Number 8. Umbridge's magic in the forest. Branches snapped underfoot as Harry and Hermione led Dolores Umbridge deeper into the forbidden forest. Shadows moved in the undergrowth. The air was thick and damp. When a twig cracked behind them, Umbridge's wand was instantly up. "Incarcerus!" she barked, ropes springing from thin air. The spell landed flawlessly, quick and precise, a display you'd expect from a battle-trained aura, not a ministry bureaucrat whose greatest weapon until now had been a quill and a pink cardigan. Yet the Forbidden Forest was no ordinary place. Earlier books made it clear that its magic was unpredictable. In Chamber of Secrets, Hagrid warned that strange things live in there, and spells could fail when creatures interfered. Even in Prisoner of Azkaban, Harry and Hermione saw how the forest's presence seemed to twist light and sound, making magic less reliable. But here, Umbridge's charms worked without a flicker of resistance, as though the forest had simply decided its own rules no longer applied. It's an odd moment when you think about her skill set. Umbridge specialized in defensive enchantments and ministry protocol. She wasn't a duelist like Mad-Eye Moody or even Lupin. Yet in the forest, surrounded by hostile centaurs and volatile magic, she moved her wand with the calm efficiency of a field operative. Whether it was an oversight or intentional exaggeration, the scene quietly breaks the logic the books had set up about how magic behaves under the forest's ancient canopy. Number 9. Letters from Sirius. Harry unfolded the scrap of parchment. Just one sentence in Sirius's handwriting. "Keep your head down. Don't do anything rash." He read it twice, frowning. This was all? Weeks without a word, and now a note shorter than one of Hermione's homework titles. It was nothing like the long, vivid letters Sirius had once sent, filled with advice, jokes, and warnings. In Goblet of Fire, Sirius had been in hiding, living off rats in a cave near Hogsmeade. The Ministry was hunting him. Dementors patrolled the castle grounds. Still he had written page after page, guiding Harry through the Triwizard Tournament. He had sent advice on dealing with dragons, shared his suspicions about Barty Crouch, and even risked sneaking into the Gryffindor common room via the fireplace. If he could write then, under constant threat, why couldn't he write now? At number 12, Grimmauld Place, Sirius was surrounded by protective enchantments and members of the Order of the Phoenix. No Dementors, no patrols, no immediate danger. The house itself was hidden from outsiders by the Fidelius charm. Here, more than anywhere else, he had the freedom to pour out his thoughts without fear of interception. Yet his letters to Harry remained painfully brief, almost cold. It's hard not to wonder why. Was Sirius avoiding the risk of owls being tracked? Was he worried someone in the Order would read his words? Or did the author simply want Harry to feel isolated, cutting off one of his few emotional lifelines? Whatever the reason, the silence felt out of character. The man who once wrote, "If you need me, I will be there," had every chance to prove it, and instead left Harry waiting by an empty window. Number 10. The portrait of Sirius's mother. Tonks stumbles over the troll leg umbrella stand, The curtains fly open, while Burger Black erupts from the frame. "Filth! Mudbloods! Traitors!" she shrieks, the hall ringing with her fury. Sirius and Remus rush in, yanking the curtains shut with both hands. Molly hisses at everyone to keep quiet. The house holds its breath until the last echo dies. Sirius explains why the portrait stays. His mother fixed it to the wall with a permanent sticking charm. They tried prying, they tried force. Nothing budged. Fair enough. If the canvas can't be removed, you live with it. But living with it should not mean surrendering to nightly alarms that wake the entire row. Because there is another question. Why not silence it? The silencing charm exists in this very book. Hermione practices silencio in class. Remus Lupin knows advanced defensive magic. Alastair Moody has seen every trick in the Auror's manual. One targeted charm should dampen the noise. Even a temporary hush would spare number 12 from constant chaos. Instead, every commotion ends the same way. Tonks trips, Walburga screams, Creature mutters gleefully, Sirius clenches his jaw, the Order scrambles to smother a portrait like it's a living bomb. It's funny, yes, but it strains logic. In a house filled with capable witches and wizards, no one casts the simplest fix. The comedy works. The rules of magic bend to make it happen. Number 11, Hermione's Owl. Crookshanks sat on the common room table, his yellow eyes fixed on Hermione. The letter lay folded beside him, sealed with a neat charm. "Take this to Sirius," she said softly, stroking his ginger fur. Without hesitation, the half-Kneazle leapt down, tail twitching as if he understood every word. It was an oddly matter-of-fact moment, the sort you might miss if you weren't paying attention. But for anyone who remembered the rules of the wizarding world, it was baffling. Owls had always been the lifeline of magical communication. From Hedwig's early morning deliveries to the flocks that filled the Great Hall at breakfast, the system was absolute. Cats, no matter how clever, were never shown delivering mail. Crookshanks, despite his sharp mind and uncanny instincts, was still a cat, and yet here he was, apparently stepping into the role of an owl without so much as a raised eyebrow from Harry or Ron. "He'll know where to find him," Hermione said, her tone confident, as if this were perfectly normal. The scene clashed with every other example in the series. When Harry needed to send a letter, he relied on Hedwig, or borrowed another owl from the school's owlery. Ron did the same with Pigwidgeon. Even the Weasley family, who lived with Crookshanks for a time, never once suggested he could carry a message. If magical cats could deliver mail, why maintain an entire network of trained owls? Why would Hogwarts bother with an owlery at all? Perhaps the moment was meant to emphasize Crookshanks' intelligence, his ability to act almost human. But in doing so, it quietly bent one of the series' most consistent rules. A cat delivering letters was not just unusual, it was unprecedented, and yet, in that cozy Gryffindor common room, no one questioned it. The letter was sent, the story moved on, and the world of Harry Potter suddenly had a mailman with whiskers and a purr. Number 12, Hogwarts and Broomsticks. The January air in the Hogwarts courtyard was sharp, the kind that stung your cheeks and made every sound carry. Harry kicked off from the ground, his firebolt slicing upward with a rush of wind. Fred and George were right behind him, their brooms tilting into a graceful climb. From below, the students roared with approval. It wasn't just flying, it was defiance, a public show of loyalty to Hagrid, who had just returned from a mysterious absence. Yet the rules on broom flying were crystal clear. Outside of Quidditch practice or official matches, flying on school grounds was forbidden. Back in Harry's first year, Madam Hooch had threatened immediate expulsion when he dared to chase after Neville's Remembrall. "Come down this instant," she had barked then, her whistle shrill in the air. But now, with 3 Gryffindors soaring across the courtyard, there was no whistle, no stern shouts. Only Dolores Umbridge's furious voice echoing from the far side, too far away to stop them. The absence of reaction from the rest of the staff was striking. Professors Flitwick and Sprout had been seen crossing the courtyard earlier. Even Filch had been lurking near the doors. None of them moved to stop the airborne trio. It was as if the long-standing ban on casual broom flight had been suspended, but only for those bold enough to challenge authority. "Look at them go!" someone shouted from below, and the cheers drowned out any thought of discipline. In a school where broken rules usually meant immediate consequences, this moment stood out like a blazing banner. Either the teachers quietly approved of the protest, or they had simply decided that Umbridge's brand of order wasn't worth enforcing. Whatever the reason, Harry, Fred, and George flew their circles high above the crowd, untouched by school law, their brooms slicing through the winter sky as if the rules had never existed at all. Number 13, Snape's legilimency spell. Severus. Snape stood in the dimly lit classroom, his black eyes fixed on Harry Potter. Without a word of warning, he raised his wand. "Legilimens!" The word struck like a whip. In an instant, Harry felt his mind ripped open. Memories spilled before him, Dudley laughing as he shoved him, the Sorting Hat's voice whispering in his ear, the mirror of Erised glowing in a dusty room. He staggered back, gasping. This was no lesson, it was an invasion. In the wizarding world, legilimency without consent was no small matter. It was a serious breach, nearly as grave as using an unforgivable curse. The law existed for a reason, to protect a wizard's most private possession, his mind. And yet here was Snape, doing it in plain sight, in a Hogwarts classroom. There were no witnesses to intervene, no ministry official to raise an objection. Just the sharp snap of Snape's command and the sickening rush of images Harry had not given him permission to see. The moment was all the more jarring because of what Snape was supposed to be teaching. Occlumency, the art of shielding the mind, required trust between teacher and pupil. Instead, Snape shattered that trust. "Clear your mind!" he barked, as though Harry's failure to defend himself was a sign of laziness rather than shock. The irony was brutal. How could Harry learn to defend his thoughts when his instructor treated them like an open book to be flipped through at will? What makes the scene even more troubling is the silence that followed. No one in authority reprimanded Snape. Dumbledore knew of the lessons, yet took no steps to stop the method. In a world where no wizard has the right to enter another's mind uninvited, as Mad-Eye Moody once warned, the rules seemed suddenly flexible when it suited the staff of Hogwarts. For Harry, the message was clear. Some wizards could break the law, and no one would dare call them to account. Number 14. Lupin's behaviour. Remus. Lupin's behaviour in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix stands out not because he is loud or reckless, but because of his unusual silence at moments when readers would expect him to speak. In earlier books, he was the steady voice of reason, the quiet but firm defender of Harry's well-being. In The Prisoner of Azkaban, Lupin was willing to stand up to Snape, a fellow professor, to ensure Harry had a fair chance to learn and protect himself. Yet, in the 5th book, when Dolores Umbridge begins her campaign of cruelty at Hogwarts, Lupin's protective instinct seems muted, as though the man who once handed Harry a chocolate bar after a Dementor attack has now chosen to stand back in the shadows. This absence is most noticeable when compared to his earlier warmth and direct involvement in Harry's life. In The Prisoner of Azkaban, Lupin took the time to teach Harry the Patronus charm, giving him one-on-one lessons even when it was outside the scope of his formal duties. He gave Harry specific advice such as, "The Patronus is a kind of positive force, a projection of the very things that the Dementor feeds upon: hope, happiness, the desire to survive." It was a rare instance of an adult truly equipping Harry to face the dangers ahead. By the time the Order of the Phoenix unfolds, the stakes for Harry are even higher. Umbridge is not a mindless magical threat, but a deliberate, sadistic force, undermining his confidence, credibility, and emotional stability. Yet Lupin remains a background figure, present but seemingly powerless, offering no such lifeline. When Umbridge's reign begins, Lupin is a member of the Order, aware that Hogwarts is now under the control of someone openly hostile to Dumbledore and anyone connected to him. He knows Harry is already burdened with the trauma of witnessing Cedric Diggory's death and facing Voldemort's return. In fact, the Order is explicitly aware that the Ministry is attempting to discredit Harry. Still, Lupin does not appear to take any personal initiative to shield him from the constant detentions, verbal abuse, and public humiliation. His position as an Order member, though unofficial within the school, might have given him channels to influence events indirectly. Yet the narrative gives no indication that he tried. The contrast becomes even sharper when recalling Lupin's willingness to confront authority in The Prisoner of Azkaban. He had no trouble undermining Snape's efforts to embarrass Harry during lessons, and he directly defended Harry's need to know the truth about Sirius Black. In that earlier context, Lupin balanced kindness with firmness, showing Harry that adults could be both compassionate and brave. In The Order of the Phoenix, however, the Lupin we see is subdued, almost detached, providing polite updates in Grimmauld Place, but never addressing the elephant in the room, that Harry is being systematically broken down by a teacher placed there to control him. One particularly striking moment is the Christmas gathering at Grimmauld Place. Harry, fresh from another detention, is exhausted and bitter. Lupin is present, seated beside Sirius, talking quietly about Order matters. He listens to Harry's frustrations but does not offer a plan or even moral reassurance beyond general sympathy. For a man who once risked professional standing to help Harry cast a Patronus, this restraint feels almost foreign. The man who had looked a Dementor in the face to protect his students now seems unwilling to openly criticize Umbridge's tactics or suggest ways Harry might resist them. There is also the fact that Lupin, of all people, understands the psychological damage of constant marginalization. As a werewolf, he has lived with prejudice, isolation, and the suspicion of those in power. Umbridge's attacks on Harry mirror the same tactics used by the Ministry to sideline dangerous individuals. Lupin should have recognized the emotional toll these measures would take. Yet, the story gives us no instance where he shares his own experience with Harry, perhaps to help him understand that institutional cruelty can be resisted. His silence here is not just curious. It is a missed opportunity for deep character resonance. Some readers might argue that Lupin's position within the Order limited his ability to act openly, that he was already under scrutiny due to his werewolf status. However, that explanation fails to align with his past behavior. In The Prisoner of Azkaban, Lupin was under the same stigma and yet openly mentored Harry. Even in The Goblet of Fire, though not a main character, he maintained a subtle but supportive presence. In The Order of the Phoenix, his role shifts almost entirely to that of a messenger carrying news, reporting on missions, while the personal dimension of his bond with Harry diminishes. The inconsistency becomes more glaring when we consider that Sirius, with far less freedom and far more risk, still attempts to guide Harry, even if recklessly. Sirius writes letters, tries to communicate through the fire, and openly voices his distrust of Umbridge. Lupin, in contrast, remains measured to the point of passivity. The difference between the two men is not surprising. Sirius acts on emotion, Lupin on logic, but here, logic should have dictated some form of intervention, especially as Harry's mental state worsens. Rowling even gives Lupin moments where he could have shown more agency. When Harry is summoned to the hearing at the Ministry for using magic, Lupin attends the meeting at Grimmauld Place where the news is discussed. His reaction is calm, too calm, as if he does not fully register the danger Harry faces from the Ministry's hostility. He expresses mild concern but quickly shifts focus to other topics. This is far removed from the man who once fought to give Harry the tools to defend himself from forces that threatened his life. Number 15. Cho Chang's Patronus. During the training sessions of Dumbledore's army in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, there is a moment that stands out not only for its visual charm, but also for the odd questions it leaves behind. The Room of Requirement is alive with excitement as students attempt the notoriously difficult Patronus charm, their breath misting in the air as if the magic itself chills the space. In the middle of this lively and chaotic scene, Cho Chang steps forward, focuses, and conjures a perfectly formed, shining swan. The book describes it with a striking simplicity, noting that she produced a graceful, gliding swan Patronus without any sign of strain. The scene is meant to be uplifting, a moment of magical achievement. But for any reader who remembers how demanding this charm is supposed to be, the ease with which Cho accomplishes it raises a brow. The Patronus charm is established throughout the series as one of the most advanced defensive spells in the wizarding world. Remus Lupin makes this point abundantly clear in Prisoner of Azkaban when he explains to Harry that the Patronus is a kind of positive force. It's a very advanced bit of magic, Harry. He even notes that many qualified adult witches and wizards struggle to produce a corporeal Patronus at all. We see concrete examples. Nymphadora Tonks, a fully trained aura and member of the Order, at one point cannot summon her Patronus properly due to emotional strain. The implication is that this spell not only demands skill but also a precise emotional state, which makes it a rare achievement. Given this context, Cho's swan gliding into existence without hesitation or apparent struggle feels surprisingly convenient for the story. If we examine the timeline, the puzzle becomes more noticeable. Cho is a year older than Harry, placing her in her 6th year at Hogwarts during the events of Order of the Phoenix. Before the DA meetings, there is no mention in any of the books that she had been trained in complex defensive magic beyond the standard school curriculum. Hogwarts, after all, follows a fixed defense against the dark arts syllabus, and prior years under teachers like Gilderoy Lockhart or Dolores Umbridge offered little genuine instruction. This makes the likelihood of Cho already mastering such a rare skill even slimmer. Her only known extracurricular advantage is her participation in Quidditch, which develops reflexes and focus, but this is a far cry from the mental discipline required for a Patronus. Harry's own journey with the charm shows just how rare such proficiency is. In Prisoner of Azkaban, it takes him multiple lessons under Lupin's direct and patient guidance to produce even a wisp of a corporeal Patronus. This training occurs in a carefully controlled environment with repeated practice and specific coaching. His stag does not appear in full strength until the climax at the lake, when desperation and resolve merge in a moment of intense emotion. The fact that Harry struggles despite his immense motivation, saving himself and Sirius from Dementors, underscores how difficult this charm really is. Against this backdrop, Cho's effortless swan seems almost implausible. The scene in Order of the Phoenix offers no build-up to Cho's success. The DA has only recently formed, and this is their first attempt at conjuring Patronuses. We see students like Neville Longbottom, Dean Thomas, and Seamus Finnegan barely managing to create silvery vapours, exactly as expected for their level of experience. Yet Cho's swan emerges fully formed in the same session, drawing Harry's attention and, conveniently, adding a soft, romantic glow to their developing relationship. It is hard not to see this as a narrative choice designed to make her stand out to Harry, rather than a moment rooted in logical progression of magical skill. The mechanics of the Patronus spell deepen the inconsistency. To cast it successfully, a wizard must focus on their happiest memory and channel a surge of positive emotion strong enough to repel the soul-sucking despair of a Dementor. Lupin explains that it is not just a matter of thinking of something pleasant, it must be a memory charged with joy so powerful it can manifest as magic. For a 16-year-old student with no battlefield experience and no training against Dementors, summoning such intensity on command is rare. Harry's own happiest memory during training was hearing his parents' voices, something deeply personal and tied to intense emotion. What was Cho's? The books never reveal it, leaving the reader to assume that she simply has the emotional resilience and focus to rival seasoned members of the Order, which feels like a stretch. Even more telling are the examples of other skilled witches and wizards. In Deathly Hallows, Kingsley Shacklebolt, a top-tier aura, uses his patronus to deliver a warning to guests at Bill and Fleur's wedding. His lynx appears effortlessly, a clear sign of his elite training. Minerva McGonagall's cat patronus is similarly impressive and used for complex communication. These are characters with years, decades of magical experience. Placing Cho's ability alongside theirs dilutes the established scale of difficulty. It's as if the narrative momentarily lowers the bar to allow her a dazzling display which undermines the carefully built mystique of the charm. The romantic subtext adds another layer to this. At the time of the DA meetings, Harry is infatuated with Cho, and their interactions are tinged with awkwardness and mutual attraction. By giving Cho a graceful, beautiful patronus right in front of him, Rowling creates a symbolic connection. Her swan complements his stag, both noble and elegant creatures. It serves the thematic purpose of drawing them closer. However, when viewed critically, it also serves the plot too neatly, almost as if the laws of magical difficulty bend to accommodate a moment of teenage romance. It is a case where emotional impact takes precedence over internal logic. Number 16. Muggles and the Strange Weather. That summer in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix begins under a strange and almost oppressive sky. Britain is shrouded in weather patterns that defy logic. Sheets of relentless rain fall for days, only to be replaced by scorching heat. And then, without warning, thick mists roll in from nowhere, swallowing entire streets. This is not the ordinary unpredictability of the British climate that magpies and weather forecasters might complain about. As the narrator quietly reveals, this turbulence in the air is the echo of something darker. Dementors are stirring, and dark magic is leaking into the Muggle world. Yet while the Ministry of Magic busies itself with internal politics and campaigns against Albus Dumbledore, there is a glaring omission in their priorities. No one seems concerned that Muggles might notice. The opening chapters lay this out with unnerving clarity. The narrator remarks on the way Harry sits outside in Privet Drive's garden, sweltering under an unusual heatwave, trying to catch the sound of the evening news. The television reporter talks about unseasonal fogs, violent storms and heatwaves, puzzled at how such extremes could occur in rapid succession. The reader understands what the Muggle meteorologists cannot. This is the ripple of the magical war inching closer. And yet there is no mention of obliviators being dispatched, no Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes working overtime to repair the Statute of Secrecy's fragile fabric. The Ministry's silence feels almost deafening. It's a curious lapse because Rowling has already shown us in earlier books how strictly magical authorities guard their secrecy. In Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, for instance, the accidental inflation of Aunt Marge and the flying Ford Anglia cause immediate intervention from the Ministry, even to the point of threatening Harry with expulsion. In Prisoner of Azkaban, the appearance of Sirius Black sends the Ministry scrambling to control public perception, but in Order of the Phoenix we are told that Dementors are deployed into the Muggle world itself, attacking Harry and Dudley in Little Whinging, without any indication that Muggle witnesses to such a supernatural cold front might be dealt with. The inconsistency is hard to ignore. The weather is more than just background scenery. It is a direct consequence of magical interference. Dementors, as we know from Prisoner of Azkaban, suck the warmth and light from the air, leaving only cold, despair, and mist in their wake. Their presence is detectable not only to wizards but to Muggles, albeit in less defined ways. Rowling describes the Little Whinging evening as one where the warm summer air seemed suddenly icy cold, and where a creeping fog swirled around them moments before the Dementors appear. If Dementors can alter the climate so dramatically, then their widespread activity over Britain, implied by the persistent weather anomalies, would be impossible for Muggles to miss. This raises the uncomfortable question: why is no one in authority reacting? We are told repeatedly throughout the book that Cornelius Fudge, the Minister for Magic, is obsessed with discrediting Dumbledore and silencing Harry's testimony about Voldemort's return. But political rivalry should not completely erase the Ministry's responsibility to uphold the international statute of secrecy. If Muggles are noticing fogs that last for weeks and storms that strike without cause, they might begin to suspect that something unnatural is at play. In the Goblet of Fire, even the appearance of the dark mark at the Quidditch World Cup, an event mostly filled with wizards, sparks a full-scale investigation, yet here, mass meteorological anomalies are brushed aside. The absurdity of this neglect becomes more apparent when compared to the way the Ministry reacts to smaller breaches. In Chamber of Secrets, a simple hover charm used by Dobby triggers an official letter to Harry within minutes. The Ministry is vigilant when a lone Muggle might see a floating pudding, but seemingly indifferent when millions of Muggles are drenched, roasted, and chilled in the same week by magical forces. The dissonance between these responses makes the opening of Order of the Phoenix feel like a rare lapse in Rowling's otherwise careful internal logic. Some might argue that perhaps the Ministry assumed Muggles would attribute the strange weather to climate fluctuations, avoiding the need for intervention, but this explanation is unsatisfying, especially when we recall Arthur Weasley's explanation in Goblet of Fire that even the smallest magical disturbances are monitored to prevent suspicion. The idea that they would overlook an entire season's worth of magical influence undermines the seriousness with which the statute of secrecy is treated elsewhere in the series. This isn't a one-off magical mishap, it is a sustained alteration of the natural order. The issue deepens when we consider that Rowling gives the Muggle media a voice in this moment. The news reports are not vague murmurs, they are specific, puzzled commentaries on phenomena that the reporters cannot explain. Experts are baffled, one broadcast says, by the string of freak weather incidents affecting the country. That line, simple as it is, opens a door to a dangerous thought. What if Muggles did begin to investigate in earnest? What if meteorologists noticed correlations between these events and certain locations, or worse, linked them to unusual crimes and disappearances caused by magical conflict? Rowling never explores this possibility, yet it lingers in the subtext. Harry himself is aware that something unnatural is happening, though his focus is less on the Muggle perspective and more on his own isolation. Sitting in the oppressive heat, listening to the news for scraps of magical hints, he is a boy on the edge of a secret war. His irritation at the lack of contact from his friends mirrors the reader's growing frustration with the Ministry's inaction. It is as though the Ministry's willful ignorance of Voldemort's return has spilled over into willful ignorance of the very real threat to their most sacred lore. Number 17. Neville's memory. Neville Longbottom's presence in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix takes on a new weight when the reader encounters the scene in which members of Dumbledore's army are discussing the past crimes of the Death Eaters. In the Room of Requirement, the conversation drifts toward those who had fought against Voldemort during his first rise to power, and suddenly Neville, usually shy and awkward, reveals something that lands with a jolt. His parents, Frank and Alice Longbottom, were tortured into madness by Bellatrix Lestrange and her fellow Death Eaters. He says this without hesitation, recounting names and the nature of the crime, as if it were a truth he had carried consciously for years. Yet in earlier books, Neville's references to his parents were so vague and evasive that the contrast is startling. The reader cannot help but wonder how, when, and from whom Neville learned these harrowing details, and why this knowledge surfaces so suddenly now. In Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, the only clear indication about Neville's parents comes during the visit to St. Mungo's, recounted later in Order of the Phoenix. Until then, Neville's family life is mostly hinted at through his grandmother Augusta, whose stern demeanour keeps Harry and his friends from prying. The one moment of stark clarity before Book 5 is in Goblet of Fire, when Neville reacts with visible discomfort during the lesson on the Cruciatus Curse. Moody, or rather Barty Crouch Jr. in disguise, demonstrates it on a spider, and the horror in Neville's face is described by Rowling with unsettling precision. Neville's pale face went even paler, and his hands clenched on the desk in front of him. Hermione notices and tries to comfort him, suggesting she knows more than the others, but Neville himself does not speak. The reader senses a trauma, but it is a silent trauma, not one Neville articulates. This makes his sudden openness in Order of the Phoenix all the more puzzling. In the chapter The Eye of the Snake, he tells Harry, Ron, and Hermione that Bellatrix Lestrange tortured his parents into insanity with the Cruciatus curse, doing so in service of Voldemort after his fall. He adds that they were searching for information about Voldemort's whereabouts. Neville speaks the names Bellatrix, her husband Rodolphus, and Barty Crouch, Jr. with certainty. There is no hesitation in his voice as Rowling writes, "They were all sent to Azkaban." The detail is not vague, it is crisp, factual, complete. For a character who in earlier books could barely acknowledge his parents beyond saying they were in St. Mungo's, the shift is dramatic. The question becomes unavoidable. How did Neville acquire this precise knowledge? In earlier installments, Rowling carefully framed Neville's background as a sensitive, unspoken topic, one guarded by his grandmother and largely unknown to his peers. In Philosopher's Stone, when Neville's remembrall turns red, the reader sees him as forgetful and timid, not someone with a clearly defined tragic past in the foreground. By Prisoner of Azkaban, the closest the reader comes to family detail is his fear of his grandmother's reaction to losing passwords, hardly the type of moment where a revelation about Bellatrix would naturally emerge. If Neville had always known exactly who attacked his parents and how, the emotional impact of these earlier scenes might have been different. Some readers have speculated that Neville's detailed knowledge in Order of the Phoenix could have come from overhearing adult conversations, perhaps between Augusta Longbottom and members of the Order. However, such a transfer of information would likely have been addressed earlier in the series if it had happened years before. Given Augusta's protective nature, it seems improbable that she would have willingly burdened young Neville with the graphic truth. Indeed, in Order of the Phoenix, Augusta's appearance at St. Mungo's suggests she has only recently allowed Neville to connect more directly with his parents' history, evidenced by her brusque comment to Harry that Neville should be proud of his parents. If that is the case, the moment in the Room of Requirement would mark not just a narrative reveal to the reader, but a personal turning point for Neville, one Rowling never explicitly sets up. Another possibility lies in the timeline of Order of the Phoenix itself. By the time Neville speaks in the Room of Requirement, Sirius Black has openly mentioned Bellatrix's name to Harry, tying her to the Lestrange family. It's conceivable that Neville might have pieced things together through bits of information dropped in the escalating war. The problem with this explanation is that Rowling writes Neville's statement as though it is old knowledge, not a recent deduction. His words carry the tone of someone recalling a long-established fact, not someone still processing a fresh discovery. This tonal certainty deepens the inconsistency. The reader is left unsure whether Neville's silence in earlier years was self-imposed or simply a product of Rowling not yet having decided how much he knew. The emotional weight of Neville's revelation also clashes with the way earlier books handle his character arc. In Chamber of Secrets and Prisoner of Azkaban, his role is often comic relief, the clumsy boy who loses things or gets into accidents. Had readers known all along that this same boy carried the knowledge that his parents were tortured into madness by named Death Eaters, the humour might have read differently, shaded with tragedy rather than simple ineptitude. Rowling's decision to withhold this information until Book 5 amplifies the drama in the moment, but it raises questions about the plausibility of Neville's memory and the internal logic of the series. In the wizarding world, traumatic memories are complex, especially in children. Rowling does not explore whether Neville's recollection of the attack itself is first-hand, he was an infant at the time, or entirely second-hand, In real terms, he could not have remembered the event. He would have had to be told about it later. That makes the source of his knowledge crucial. If Augusta Longbottom had shared these details years earlier, why would Neville never have brought them up, even in moments of trust with Harry or Hermione? Conversely, if she told him only recently, the narrative in Order of the Phoenix misses an opportunity to show that emotional conversation and the shift it would have caused in Neville's sense of self. The problem is magnified by the fact that the attack on Frank and Alice Longbottom was a high-profile case in the wizarding world. The trial is shown in Goblet of Fire through Dumbledore's Pensive, where Harry sees Bellatrix Lestrange, her husband, and Barty Crouch Jr. convicted. In that scene, Harry is witnessing something Neville presumably has never seen, and yet Neville, in Order of the Phoenix, recounts the same names without hesitation. This would mean Neville either learned the names separately or had some access to the same trial record, neither of which Rowling depicts. The absence of that connective tissue in the story creates the sense of a narrative leap, a sudden retroactive depth that hasn't been organically built. Moreover, the scene's emotional architecture hinges on Neville's choice to share his parents' fate with Dumbledore's army. It is not an intimate moment with one or two close friends. It is a declaration in front of a group. For a character as private and self-conscious as Neville, this openness suggests a level of comfort and acceptance that seems absent in earlier books. If he had always carried this knowledge, why did he not confide in Harry earlier, especially after the events of Goblet of Fire, where they shared the trauma of the Triwizard Tournament? The sudden shift in disclosure behavior is as striking as the shift in factual knowledge. This inconsistency also affects the reader's perception of Neville's growth. By Order of the Phoenix, Neville is becoming braver, more competent, and more willing to stand up for himself. His involvement in the Department of Mystery's battle cements him as a true member of the fight against Voldemort. Yet the missing explanation for his detailed knowledge risks making this transformation feel partially unearned. Growth in fiction works best when it follows visible steps. Here, one of those steps, confronting and integrating the truth about his parents, is left entirely off the page. Some fans defend the moment as a deliberate choice by Rowling to mirror real-life grief and trauma, where survivors sometimes reveal long-hidden truths suddenly without warning because the context finally feels safe. Under this interpretation, Neville might have known the facts for some time, but lacked the courage or opportunity to say them aloud until Dumbledore's army became a space of solidarity. While this explanation has emotional merit, it still depends on the assumption that the information was given to Neville well before this scene, and again, the books give no evidence of when or how that occurred. There is also the matter of narrative convenience. By having Neville openly name Bellatrix Lestrange in Order of the Phoenix, Rowling sets up the dramatic confrontation in Half-Blood Prince and Deathly Hallows, where Neville faces her in battle with personal vengeance. The stakes are instantly clear to the reader because the connection was established in Book 5. From a storytelling standpoint, this works. From a continuity standpoint, it reads as though Neville's backstory was expanded retroactively to serve the later plot. The result is a powerful but slightly dissonant emotional beat. Ultimately, Neville's revelation about his parents in Order of the Phoenix stands as one of those moments in the Harry Potter series that is both moving and narratively awkward. The raw honesty of his words in the Room of Requirement is unforgettable, but the path that should have led him to that point is missing. The earlier book's careful avoidance of detail makes this sudden clarity feel almost as though two different versions of Neville exist. The boy who knows nothing more than "my parents are in St. Mungo's," and the young man who can recite the names of their torturers. That gap, left unexplored, is what turns this into a rare continuity lapse in Rowling's otherwise meticulous world-building. Number 18. The disappearance of Mundungus Fletcher. In Harry Potter, and the Order of the Phoenix, Mundungus Fletcher appears as one of those shifty but oddly indispensable members of the Order, the kind of man who, despite his dubious morals, seems to always be in the right place to overhear the wrong people. He is introduced early in the story as someone Dumbledore trusts enough to keep an eye on Harry's home during the summer. In fact, in the first chapters, Mundungus is one of the very few wizards actually stationed outside Number 4 Privet Drive. His purpose is clear: to watch for Death Eater activity and immediately report anything unusual. His presence in the narrative is not merely decorative. Rowling uses him to pass key intelligence to the Order and to add a touch of comedic roguishness to the otherwise tense situation. Yet somewhere between the tense beginning and the climactic battle at the Department of Mysteries, Mundungus simply disappears. The reader turns the pages expecting him to resurface, perhaps at Grimmauld Place with another overheard tidbit or during the final showdown. But his absence becomes a narrative hole. The moment that cements his relevance occurs midway through the book, when Harry, staying at 12 Grimmauld Place, overhears Mundungus reporting on Death Eater movements. Rowling makes sure to give him lines that position him as a man on the fringes of danger, gathering scraps of information in shady ways. "Been watching that house like you said, Albus," Mundungus tells them, according to the text, "and I seen them sniffing around. They're up to summit. It's not throwaway." Dialogue. It gives the reader a sense that Mundungus is an active agent in the Order's network, contributing to the broader intelligence effort. If we're reading with the logic of a mystery or war novel, a character in such a role should be present when that intelligence becomes critical. Instead, after this scene, Mundungus fades away so completely that a casual reader could be forgiven for forgetting he was ever involved. This is particularly odd because Rowling establishes him as a physical witness to critical events. In the opening chapters, when Harry and Dudley are attacked by Dementors, Mundungus is explicitly mentioned as having abandoned his post that evening, a mistake that forces him into Dumbledore's scolding. This incident not only proves his assigned role, but also hints that he might be looking for redemption. In a well-sewn narrative thread, this would have been the perfect setup for him to later take decisive action, perhaps risking himself to make up for that early blunder. Instead, no such redemption occurs. The storyline sets him up for a return, but the payoff never comes. If we examine the narrative architecture, the omission becomes even stranger. By the time Harry, Hermione, Ron, Ginny, Neville, and Luna infiltrate the Department of Mysteries, the Order's adult members arrive to fight the Death Eaters. We see Sirius, Lupin, Moody, Tonks, and Kingsley Shacklebolt, the heavy hitters. A character like Mundungus could have added a touch of chaotic unpredictability to that battle, perhaps providing an unexpected assist or comic relief amidst the danger. Instead, Rowling keeps him entirely off stage, as if he ceased to exist in the story world. This is not a matter of him being absent for logistical reasons. We are given no explanation. The omission is total, almost surgical. The absence is more glaring when one considers that Rowling tends to account for even minor characters during climactic moments. In earlier books, figures like Dobby or Professor Lockhart are woven back into the story to resolve subplots or provide crucial turning points. Mundungus, by contrast, is treated almost like a discarded prop. His intelligence-gathering scenes in the first half of the book suggest that his information could have influenced the Order's strategy or the Ministry infiltration, but there is no evidence this happened. Readers are left with a dangling narrative thread, an agent in a spy network who vanishes without debriefing. One of the key frustrations for attentive readers lies in the way Mundungus's role in protecting Harry's family home is portrayed. The text makes clear that the Dursleys' house is under close watch. In fact, Harry learns early on that a couple of blokes from the Order are keeping tabs. This knowledge builds suspense. The implication is that any attack on Privet Drive would be noticed immediately and that the Watchers, including Mundungus, are the first line of defense. But once Harry leaves the Dursleys' house, the entire protection subplot evaporates. There is no scene where Mundungus reports on the status of the house, no discussion of whether Death Eaters have shifted their tactics, and no indication that his surveillance role continued or ended. To fully appreciate the narrative gap, it helps to remember how Rowling frames the final act. The rescue mission to the Ministry is chaotic and last-minute, with members of the Order racing in response to Harry's call. Here is where a character like Mundungus, already embedded near Harry for months, would logically be among the first notified. If anything, his opportunistic nature and knack for being in the wrong place at the right time could have made him a wild card in the battle. Yet Rowling provides no line about him being unavailable, injured, or otherwise indisposed. The silence is complete, and the reader is left wondering if he even remained in the Order's service during those critical days. There is also a tonal impact to his absence. Mundungus serves as one of the few morally ambiguous members of the Order, someone whose loyalty is reliable enough to trust with certain tasks, but whose personal ethics are suspect. In a climactic battle scene, this ambiguity could have heightened the tension. Would he fight bravely or cut and run when things got dangerous? By not including him, Rowling misses an opportunity to explore how flawed characters respond under extreme pressure. This omission narrows the emotional palette of the Order's portrayal, making it seem more uniformly heroic than earlier chapters suggested. From a structural perspective, the disappearance feels like an editing oversight. Mundungus is woven into the early plot with enough prominence that the reader's subconscious flags him as a piece of the larger puzzle. Good narrative economy demands that such a piece be used or at least accounted for by the end. Instead, the Chekhov's gun principle is ignored, the gun here being a morally dubious informant planted in dangerous territory, and the story proceeds as if he were never introduced. In literature, this kind of unresolved thread can be jarring because it breaks the illusion that the fictional world operates with internal consistency. Some defenders of Rowling's plotting might argue that Mundungus's absence is intentional, meant to reinforce his unreliability and lack of commitment. After all, this is the same man who abandoned his post during the Dementor attack, preferring to haggle over stolen cauldrons. Perhaps we are to assume he simply shirked duty again when the stakes rose. But the text gives no such hint. There is no bitter aside from Moody or Lupin, no mention from Sirius about dung going missing again. Without this narrative cue, the disappearance reads not as character-driven negligence, but as an authorial oversight. It is also worth noting that Mundungus returns in Half-Blood Prince without any in-universe explanation for his absence during the Department of Mysteries battle. His reappearance is casual, as if nothing unusual happened, further emphasizing that the earlier disappearance was not a planned mystery, but a dropped thread. The seamless way he steps back into the Order's world in Book 6, selling stolen goods and angering Mrs. Weasley, only deepens the oddity. If he were persona non grata after a failure in Order of the Phoenix, some acknowledgement would be expected. Instead, continuity is treated as if it never broke. When we compare his arc to those of other side characters in the same book, the gap becomes starker. Take Kingsley Shacklebolt, for example. Introduced as an aura with undercover duties, he is not present in every scene but is accounted for during the climax. Tonks, too, moves in and out of the story, but appears when needed, fulfilling her role in the battle and its aftermath. Mundungus is the outlier, introduced, used for plot setup, then dropped without follow-through. This contrast makes his omission feel less like a matter of narrative necessity and more like a missing puzzle piece. In terms of reader engagement, the Mundungus gap matters because it undermines the sense that all parts of the Order are active in the fight. Rowling takes care to show the Order as a network of wizards and witches with varied skills, from the combat-ready to the covert. By leaving out a character who was positioned as a street-level operative, the depiction tilts toward the elite fighters, leaving the underbelly of the Order's operations underexplored. For a story that otherwise thrives on fleshing out even minor characters, This is a rare and noticeable lapse. Finally, the scene that could have anchored his presence is easy to imagine. As the Death Eaters and the Order clash in the spinning rooms of the Department of Mysteries, Mundungus could have stumbled in, bringing news from outside or even accidentally foiling a Death Eater in a moment of slapstick heroism. It would have been entirely in keeping with his established personality, reluctant bravery in the face of chaos, and it would have tied up his narrative arc from reluctant watchman to unexpected participant. Instead, the book ends with no word from him, leaving the reader to mentally fill in the gap, an unsatisfying task when all other threads are neatly tied. Would you like me to also prepare a similar piece on another notable continuity gap in the series, so we can compare how Rowling handles different characters' disappearances? Number 19, Filch's panic. Argus Filch had been the caretaker of Hogwarts for decades, a man whose entire professional life revolved around chasing down troublemakers and extinguishing chaos before it consumed the castle. He had witnessed some of the wildest disturbances imaginable within its enchanted walls. Peeves the poltergeist alone was a daily catastrophe, hurling ink bottles from chandeliers, setting off dung bombs in the Great Hall, or charming suits of armor to sing loudly during exams. And yet, in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, during Fred and George Weasley's legendary fireworks. Stunt Filch is portrayed as a man unraveling, running up and down corridors in terror, as Rowling describes it. For a character who had endured far worse without losing his composure, the scene strikes as an odd exaggeration. One of those moments in the series where the author's comedic intent might have overridden the character's established resilience. The fireworks themselves, as described in the book, were no ordinary Catherine wheels. They were whiz-bangs of all shapes and sizes, roaring dragons that emitted fire and smoke, wheel-shaped bursts that ricocheted off walls, and explosions that spelled rude words in mid-air. They were, without question, an impressive magical spectacle, and, more importantly, an act of rebellion against Dolores Umbridge's oppressive rule. But Filch had lived through Peeves riding a vanishing cabinet down a staircase, through vanishing step incidents on the moving staircases, through the flood of slippery slime that once covered the fourth-floor corridor from end to end. In Chamber of Secrets he had been livid but not panicked when a corridor was soaked with water from a bathroom mishap. The idea that such fireworks could send him into a panic-stricken frenzy jars with the Filch who once tried to tackle Peeves, armed only with a mop. Rowling's description is vivid. Argus Filch was beside himself, running here and there, trying to stamp out fires and catch fireworks, yelling incoherently. It's comical, no doubt, but the question arises, why would a man who had weathered the magical equivalent of small wars behave like this? He had faced the infamous swamp incident of the Marauders' era, an event he still bitterly remembered, and had chased Sirius Black, an alleged mass murderer, through the castle without hesitation. His hatred of magic and longing to discipline students might have made him furious at the Weasleys' antics, but fear? That feels misplaced. His panic reads more like a first-year student's reaction, not a battle-worn custodian's. In previous books, Filch's character had been defined by two traits, relentless bitterness and unshakable determination. He was a squib in a magical castle, surrounded by wonders he could neither perform nor control. This gave him a chip on his shoulder and a near-maniacal dedication to rules. In Prisoner of Azkaban, when a storm tore through the castle and Peeves dropped a bag of tarantulas in the entrance hall, Filch responded not with panic, but with a grim satisfaction at the prospect of catching whoever was responsible. Even when his beloved cat, Mrs. Norris, was petrified, his reaction was rage and suspicion, not paralysis. The man had a thick skin forged through decades of magical mischief. It seems inconsistent that fireworks, however grand, would push him to the brink. Fred and George's stunt was, without doubt, one of their crowning moments. The twins had been building toward it for years, honing their mischief-making skills with trick wands, canary creams, and skiving snack boxes. By order of the Phoenix, their talents had evolved into a fully fledged act of civil disobedience. The fireworks were more than a prank. They were an open act of sabotage against Umbridge's authoritarian control. For comedic effect, Rowling amps up the chaos, painting the scene with the broad strokes of slapstick humour. Students cheer, teachers look the other way, and Umbridge fumes. Filch, however, is reduced to a gag character, flailing in the background, overwhelmed in a way that undermines his previously established fortitude. There is also the question of scale. Hogwarts is a magical fortress that has endured invasions, duels, and enchantments gone wrong for centuries. In Goblet of Fire, the Triwizard Tournament introduced full-scale dragon handling inside the castle grounds. In Half-Blood Prince, cursed necklaces and poisoned meads slipped through security. For a school where such events occur, magical fireworks, while disruptive, hardly seem catastrophic. The fact that Filch behaves as though the very foundations of the castle are at risk strains believability. His job, after all, was to keep order amid magical unpredictability. For someone with his tenure, this should have been another day in the office, albeit an infuriating one. The key moment comes when Rowling writes, Filch's terrified yells echoed down the corridors as a large pink dragon chased him past a group of cheering fourth years. It's funny, certainly, but imagine replacing that dragon with one of the smaller, more chaotic events Peeves had orchestrated, like the time he unscrewed all the chandeliers in the Great Hall. Would Filch have screamed in terror then? Probably not. He would have been barking orders, waving his mop like a weapon, and demanding detentions for everyone in sight. The humour in the scene works, but it's humour at the expense of the consistency of his character. It's possible Rowling intended this as a symbolic moment. By the time of Order of the Phoenix, the castle's traditional power structures were breaking down. Umbridge's takeover had disrupted normal operations, and Filch had thrown in his lot with her. He had become not just the caretaker, but an enforcer of her increasingly absurd decrees. In that light, his panic might be read as the panic of a petty authoritarian whose authority has just been obliterated in front of hundreds of witnesses. The fireworks weren't just noise and sparks, they were a public humiliation. His flailing wasn't fear of the magic itself, but fear of the collapse of his role as Umbridge's loyal servant. Yet even with that interpretation, the tone still jars. The scene is written more like a visual gag in a comedy film, with Filch as the hapless straight man than as a moment grounded in his established psychology. In earlier books, when magic overwhelmed him, his response was to double down. More threats, more rage, more complaints to Dumbledore. The Filch who tried to have Harry expelled for muddy footprints in Philosopher's Stone would not have wasted time screaming. He would have been plotting revenge. The fact that this long-standing behaviour is abandoned here makes the scene feel less like a logical extension of his character and more like a setup for laughs. It also contrasts sharply with the reactions of other staff members. Professor Flitwick, for example, is described as being quietly amused, even allowing some fireworks to continue. Professor McGonagall treats the entire affair as a harmless jab at Umbridge. Only Filch behaves as though the school is under siege. This exaggerated isolation in his reaction serves the comedy but undermines the credibility. Readers familiar with the caretaker's long history of enduring magical mayhem can't help but question why this, of all events, would unnerve him so completely. There is another layer worth noting: Filch's identity as a squib. Living in a magical environment without the ability to perform magic has always been a sore spot for him. Perhaps the fireworks, which he could neither fight nor contain without assistance, made him feel particularly powerless. However, that helplessness had always been part of his daily reality. He couldn't stop Peeves on his own either, and that never reduced him to aimless running and screaming. If anything, his lack of magic had made him resourceful, inventing mechanical and mundane ways to fight back. The Filch we know would have been grabbing buckets of water, nets, or any weapon at hand. not darting about aimlessly. Comparing this moment to his portrayal in Half-Blood Prince makes the inconsistency even starker. In that book, when chaos erupts due to the cursed necklace incident, Filch responds with sharp suspicion, interrogating students and demanding explanations. His reflex is control, not collapse. That behavioral pattern is absent in the fireworks scene, where instead of asserting authority, he becomes part of the spectacle. The caretaker, who so often loomed as a threatening presence in the corridors, is reduced to comic relief. Even in Deathly Hallows, during the Battle of Hogwarts, Filch is depicted as functioning under extreme duress. He helps evacuate students, coordinates with teachers, and takes direct orders from the staff. There is no mention of panic, even as Death Eaters breach the castle. If he can hold himself together during a siege involving dark wizards and lethal curses, it's difficult to accept that a swarm of Weasley fireworks could provoke a greater reaction. The dissonance between these portrayals makes the fireworks episode stand out as an uncharacteristic and perhaps careless depiction. One might argue that this is the nature of comedy in long series. Sometimes characters are exaggerated for a scene's immediate humor, even if it bends their consistency. The fireworks sequence is one of the most visually memorable parts of Order of the Phoenix, and Filch's frantic presence enhances the chaos for the reader's imagination. Still, for those who view the series through a lens of internal logic, it remains a small but noticeable crack in Rowling's otherwise detailed character continuity. Filch had been the eternal foil to Hogwarts mischief makers, and here he is written more like one of their victims. In the end, the scene works as spectacle. Students roaring with laughter, Umbridge seething, and the corridors alive with colour and sound. But for readers who know Filch's history, his reaction feels like a departure from the caretaker who had spent his life navigating the unpredictable currents of a magical school. The man who once hunted miscreants with a flashlight and a murderous glare is suddenly running from a pink dragon, and while it's funny, it's also a reminder that in the pursuit of a perfect comedic beat, even the most established characters can be bent to fit the joke. Number 20. Arthur Weasley's Letters. Arthur Weasley's presence in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix is one of steady loyalty, quiet strength, and an understated warmth that has made him a beloved figure among readers. He is not a man of grand speeches or dramatic gestures, but rather of quiet consistency, a father who takes care of his children without fail, and who has always extended that same care to Harry. Yet when reading through the events of Harry's 5th year, a subtle gap appears in his character portrayal. For someone depicted as so mindful of the well-being of young people, especially during difficult times, Arthur's silence toward Harry through personal letters is striking. He escorts Harry to the ministry for his disciplinary hearing, is aware of Dolores Umbridge's oppressive reign at Hogwarts, and even witnesses firsthand the impact of the ministry's smear campaign. Still, there is no moment where Arthur sends Harry a letter of encouragement or advice. That absence feels not only like a missed emotional beat, but also a point where J.K. Rowling may have overlooked the depth of Arthur's established personality. In the Weasley household, letters and communication are not uncommon. Molly Weasley sends frequent notes to her children, and Ron receives reminders, warnings, and occasional scoldings via owl post. In The Goblet of Fire, Molly even writes to Harry directly, expressing her happiness about his Triwizard selection and offering to come watch the tasks. Arthur, however, despite being a figure of paternal guidance, never once uses this channel to reach Harry in Order of the Phoenix. Given the heightened stakes of that year, the return of Voldemort, Harry's isolation at Privet Drive, the unrelenting pressure from the Ministry, it feels narratively natural for Arthur to reach out. This is especially true when recalling the genuine concern he shows for Harry after the Dementor attack in Chapter 2, A Peck of Owls, when he and Molly debate what to tell the boy and how much to shield him from the truth. Rowling's depiction of Arthur in the book makes his lack of written communication even more noticeable. In Chapter 7, The Ministry of Magic, Arthur walks Harry to his disciplinary hearing, offering quiet reassurances. He warns Harry not to lose his temper, reminds him of the importance of composure, and treats him as an adult in a way very few do at this point in the story. "Don't worry," Arthur says with his characteristic calm. "We're going to sort this out." This is precisely the sort of grounding presence that would have benefited Harry later in the term, when Umbridge escalated her punishments. The reader can almost imagine an owl arriving for Harry during a particularly low moment, bearing a letter in Arthur's neat handwriting, offering the same reassurance. But in the canon, that moment never comes. The irony is that Rowling spends considerable time reinforcing Arthur's role as a moral anchor for both Harry and his own children. He is the one who counsels restraint when the twins want to retaliate against injustices too forcefully. He steps between Sirius and Molly when tensions rise at Grimmauld Place, reminding everyone that what's right must take precedence over what feels good in the moment. These are the exact qualities that would translate well into supportive correspondence with Harry during the school year. Arthur's wisdom is not of the grand prophetic variety like Dumbledore's. It's grounded, accessible, and rooted in empathy. The narrative already shows us that Harry responds well to this kind of grounded advice. Even Harry's impatience with adults softens when Arthur speaks to him plainly. When looking at how Rowling portrays adult guidance in Order of the Phoenix, there is a stark contrast between Arthur's silence and the active efforts of others. Sirius Black, despite his own issues, sends Harry letters through Hedwig, and later through risky methods like Phineas Nigelis's portrait. Remus Lupin checks in with Harry, albeit indirectly, and even Hagrid attempts to comfort Harry after detentions with Umbridge. Molly Weasley sends Harry at least one letter in the summer before term starts. In this context, Arthur's lack of written presence stands out more. It is not that he is absent from the narrative. He is actively involved in Order operations and even suffers an attack from Nagini, a moment that deeply affects Harry. But he is physically removed from Harry for much of the school year, and without letters, that distance is left unbridged. One might argue that Arthur's responsibilities in the Order and his work at the Ministry left him too busy for correspondence. Yet Rowling gives him moments of levity and personal interest. His fascination with Muggle inventions, for instance, or his long conversations about plugs and batteries. If Arthur can find time for these small curiosities, it seems plausible that he could find the time for a quick note to Harry, especially when the boy is facing escalating punishment and social ostracization at Hogwarts. Arthur's compassion is one of his defining traits. He consoles Harry after the attack on Mr. Weasley himself, despite being the victim, focusing instead on Harry's guilt and ensuring the boy knows none of it was his fault. This empathy could have translated beautifully into a letter that Harry could carry with him through the darker days of Umbridge's reign. From a storytelling perspective, Arthur's absence in Harry's written correspondence feels like a gap that could have been filled to deepen both characters. Imagine Harry receiving a letter after one of his detentions with Umbridge, his hand still raw from writing, "I must not tell lies," into his skin. Arthur's letter might remind him of the long game, that fighting back sometimes means surviving to fight another day. It could have carried the steady tone of a man who has lived through prejudice in the Ministry, urging Harry not to let the system break him. This would have added a layer of emotional connection between them and reinforced Arthur's role as a quiet mentor. Arthur's awareness of Umbridge's hostility also makes his silence harder to justify in-world. He attends Order meetings where she is discussed, and he knows of her attempts to undermine Dumbledore and Harry. The Weasleys are not naive to the dangers Harry faces that year. In fact, they are among the most informed. Given this awareness, the choice not to send him direct words of support becomes less a matter of character motivation and more a likely oversight in the narrative. Rowling may have prioritized other plot threads: Harry's growing anger, Dumbledore's distance, and the tension with Sirius, over developing Harry's bond with Arthur in this way. The emotional payoff of Arthur sending letters could have been especially potent after his attack in Chapter 22, St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries. Harry's guilt over the incident is profound, convinced that Voldemort used him as a weapon. A letter from Arthur, written while recovering, could have reassured Harry in a way even Dumbledore's explanations could not. Arthur's voice would have been that of a survivor who refuses to let dark forces dictate his relationships, telling Harry he is valued, trusted, and not to blame. Such a moment could have reinforced one of Rowling's central themes, the resilience of love and loyalty in the face of fear. It is worth noting that Arthur's character outside of this book supports the idea that he would write such letters. In the Chamber of Secrets, he defends Harry from Lucius Malfoy's insinuations, risking his own safety to protect the boy's dignity. In the Goblet of Fire, he is deeply concerned about Harry's safety during the Triwizard Tournament and is one of the first to believe him about Voldemort's return. These are not the actions of a man who stands back silently when someone he cares for is in danger. Inconsistent characterization in Order of the Phoenix is therefore a fair criticism. Arthur's silence is not in keeping with his prior engagement in Harry's life. There is also an emotional realism to consider. Teenagers under immense stress often benefit from adult validation, even if they do not explicitly ask for it. Harry, who is increasingly isolated in Order of the Phoenix, reacts strongly to kindness from unexpected sources. A supportive note from Arthur could have been a subtle but meaningful lifeline. In narrative terms, it might have counterbalanced the relentless negativity Harry faces, offering a moment of hope amid the bitterness and rage that define much of his fifth year. Even without changing the plot, Rowling could have used Arthur's letters as a tool for world-building and thematic reinforcement. They could have reflected the Weasley family's ethos of warmth and unity, contrasted against the cold bureaucracy of the Ministry. A letter might have carried a small reminder of the Burrow, an anecdote about gnome infestations, or a joke about the twins' latest invention, grounding Harry in memories of safety. Such details would not only deepen Arthur's character, but also give readers a stronger emotional tether during the novel's darker stretches. Arthur's silence becomes even more glaring when considering how Rowling often uses small acts of kindness to foreshadow larger themes. The protective hand on Harry's shoulder, the quiet conversation before a dangerous event, these are her tools for showing that bonds of care matter as much as grand acts of heroism. A letter from Arthur could have foreshadowed the crucial role the Weasleys play in Harry's life later on, particularly in the final battle where their unity becomes a counterweight to Voldemort's fractured following. In retrospect, the omission of Arthur's letters feels less like a deliberate choice to depict distance, and more like an unintentional gap in character portrayal. For readers invested in the emotional continuity of the series, it is one of those small but telling details that can momentarily pull them out of the story. Arthur's voice, steady, wise, quietly humorous, was missing during a year when Harry needed it most. And while the narrative moves forward without it, the absence lingers, leaving us to imagine the comforting words that might have been. Number 21, The Prophecy and Dumbledore. In the closing chapters of Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, the weight of Dumbledore's choices presses down on the story like a storm cloud. After the chaos in the Department of Mysteries, after the devastating loss of Sirius Black, Harry is brought to Dumbledore's office, where the headmaster finally tells him the full prophecy. The words are stark and unyielding. Neither can live while the other survives. It is meant to be the ultimate revelation, the truth Harry has been unknowingly walking toward for years. But this scene raises a troubling question for attentive readers. Why now? Why did Dumbledore wait until Harry was broken and grieving before giving him the truth he could have told much earlier? The narrative frames this as a decision rooted in care, but when examined closely, it starts to look like a narrative gap, a choice that serves drama but not logic. Earlier in the book, we already know that Harry is aware of part of the prophecy. He overhears snippets, understands that Voldemort is after something in the Department of Mysteries, and senses that the answer lies in a glass sphere bearing his name. The danger of keeping him uninformed is not theoretical. It is immediate. And yet Dumbledore avoids him all year. Harry notices this from the very first weeks back at Hogwarts, feeling as if the man he trusted most has abandoned him. Dumbledore does not speak to him at meals, avoids his gaze during meetings, and leaves him with more questions than answers. The headmaster later admits he did this deliberately, fearing that the mental connection between Harry and Voldemort could be exploited. But the same book shows that Voldemort still succeeds in luring Harry into a trap. The avoidance, meant to protect, only seems to isolate him more. The emotional cost of this avoidance becomes most visible after Christmas, when Arthur Weasley is attacked by Nagini and Harry's vision saves him. Harry's trust in his own mind begins to erode. He worries that he might be possessed, that he is a danger to his friends. It is at this moment that Dumbledore's silence becomes more than a strategic choice. It becomes a source of harm. A few carefully chosen words from Dumbledore might have reassured him, explained the nature of the connection, and kept Harry from spiraling into fear. Instead, the silence stretches on and Harry grows more restless and suspicious. The isolation festers. By the time we reach the climax, the cost of withholding information has become catastrophic. The vision of Sirius tortured in the Department of Mysteries is exactly the kind of manipulation Dumbledore feared, and it works. Harry's desperate need to act is fueled not only by his love for Sirius, but by the months of being kept out of the loop. He cannot turn to Dumbledore for advice because he has been conditioned to expect avoidance. This leads directly to the ambush at the Ministry, the battle, and Sirius's fall through the veil. The sequence is tragic, but also frustrating. The narrative invites us to mourn with Harry, yet also to notice that the headmaster's earlier choices paved the road to this moment. When Dumbledore finally explains himself, the reasoning he gives feels incomplete. He tells Harry, "I cared about you too much," suggesting that shielding him from the prophecy was an act of love. He feared that burdening a 15-year-old with the knowledge that he might have to kill or be killed by Voldemort would damage him. But Harry is already carrying the burden of Cedric Diggory's death from the year before, already targeted as Voldemort's enemy, already marked by a childhood of loss. The idea that another layer of truth would crush him seems naive, especially given that the withholding of that truth contributed to greater suffering. Dumbledore's confession that he forgot what it might feel like to be young comes across less as a wise admission of fault and more as a way to excuse a decision that was strategically flawed. The problem deepens when we consider the prophecy itself. The part Harry didn't know, that it could apply to another child, Neville Longbottom, is less important than the part he did know, that Voldemort is determined to destroy him. The full version of the prophecy doesn't change the stakes, it clarifies them. But by delaying, Dumbledore turns a simple truth into a dramatic twist, magnifying its emotional shock. In terms of storytelling, this is powerful. In terms of in-universe logic, it is questionable. If Harry had known earlier, he might have been better prepared for Voldemort's psychological manipulations, more alert to the possibility of a trap involving his loved ones. The book even gives us a moment that undermines Dumbledore's stated logic. When Harry asks why he wasn't told sooner, Dumbledore says that he worried Voldemort might discover the prophecy through their mental link, but if that were true, then every moment Harry knew even part of it would be a risk. Voldemort already learned about the prophecy's existence from other sources. It was the incomplete information that fueled his obsession with retrieving the sphere. This means that the mental link argument, while plausible on the surface, does not fully account for the year-long silence. In fact, the danger of Voldemort's manipulation grows precisely because Harry does not understand the stakes. From a character perspective, the year of avoidance also strains Dumbledore's role as a mentor figure. Throughout the earlier books, he is the one person Harry can rely on to be honest with him, even when the truth is hard. In the Goblet of Fire, for instance, Dumbledore immediately warns Harry about Voldemort's return and begins taking steps to protect him. The sudden reversal in Order of the Phoenix is jarring. It feels less like the logical evolution of their relationship and more like a deliberate plot device to create emotional distance for the sake of drama in the final act. The strongest emotional beat in the prophecy scene is not the prophecy itself, but Harry's outburst of rage at Dumbledore. He smashes objects, shouts and vents months of pent-up frustration. Rowling writes Harry's grief vividly, showing his pain as physical, raw, and uncontainable. But this scene also inadvertently highlights the artificial nature of the setup. The rage is not only for Sirius's death, but for a year of neglect that could have been avoided. The catharsis is powerful for the reader, yet it comes with the aftertaste of knowing that it was, in part, manufactured by the withholding of a conversation that could have taken place in September. It is worth noting that other characters in the series are given information more freely. In Half-Blood Prince, Dumbledore shares extensive details of Voldemort's past with Harry, trusting him with complex truths and dangerous knowledge. This suggests that Dumbledore is not inherently opposed to preparing Harry for what's ahead. The decision to withhold the prophecy in Order of the Phoenix stands out as an anomaly, one that serves the book's dramatic arc but creates a crack in the otherwise consistent logic of Dumbledore's mentorship. Thematically, the delay in revealing the prophecy does align with the book's exploration of isolation and mistrust. Order of the Phoenix is filled with examples of Harry being kept in the dark, by the Ministry, by the Order, by his friends at times. The cumulative effect paints a picture of a hero forced to act without guidance. In this sense, Dumbledore's silence fits the mood of the book, but thematically fitting does not erase the logical question. Why would the wisest wizard of the age knowingly add to that isolation when he acknowledges the harm it causes? One could argue that Dumbledore's decision is meant to show his flaws, to remind the reader that even great men can make errors. If this is the case, then the book succeeds. Dumbledore's choices here are not the marks of an infallible genius, but of someone whose emotions cloud his judgment. His affection for Harry leads him to overprotect, and that overprotection becomes dangerous. Yet, if this was Rowling's intent, it is not made explicit. Instead, the scene reads as if we are meant to forgive Dumbledore entirely because of his emotional confession, rather than critically weigh the consequences. The irony is that the prophecy itself, while dramatic, ultimately changes little about Harry's course of action. Whether he knows it in September or June, he is still Voldemort's target, still fated to confront him. The difference lies in preparation and trust. By telling Harry earlier, Dumbledore could have preserved the bond between them and perhaps prevented Voldemort from exploiting Harry's desperation. The late revelation turns the prophecy into an emotional climax, but it also underlines the fact that its secrecy caused more harm than benefit. In the end, the withholding of the prophecy in Order of the Phoenix works beautifully as a piece of storytelling. It heightens the tragedy, amplifies the grief, and sets the stage for Harry's more mature role in the coming war, but it also stands as one of the series' most glaring logical gaps. The Dumbledore we see in earlier and later books would likely have found a way to tell Harry the truth without putting him at greater risk. In this light, the delay feels less like a character's choice and more like the author's, a narrative sleight of hand designed to make the emotional blow land harder, even if it leaves attentive readers questioning why the wisest man in the wizarding world waited until it was too late. Number 22, Percy Weasley's behavior. Percy Weasley's arc in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix is often cited as one of J.K. Rowling's boldest character moves. A son turning his back on his own family in favor of political alignment with the Ministry of Magic. Yet when one examines the sequence surrounding Arthur Weasley's brutal attack by Nagini, a glaring narrative gap appears. In earlier books, Percy was portrayed as ambitious, rule-abiding, and occasionally pompous, but he still displayed a fundamental care for his relatives. In The Goblet of Fire, for instance, Percy beamed with pride when Bill joined the family in the top box at the Quidditch World Cup. and his indignation over Rita Skeeter's nasty article about Harry suggested a shared sense of loyalty to those close to him. But in Order of the Phoenix, the moment Arthur lies in St. Mungo's hospital for magical maladies and injuries, Percy's reaction is not simply muted, it is non-existent. The narrative positions Percy's estrangement as ideological, stemming from his absolute faith in Cornelius Fudge's version of events. Fudge's paranoia about Dumbledore's supposed bid for ministerial power fuels the Ministry's propaganda, and Percy, eager to rise in the bureaucratic ranks, seizes this as an opportunity to demonstrate loyalty. He sends a cold, formal letter to Ron, urging him to distance himself from Harry and Dumbledore, declaring, "Your loyalty, Ron, should be to the Ministry." The tone is almost militaristic, with no warmth for his younger brother. Still, this political posturing makes his later silence during his father's near-fatal injury feel jarringly hollow. Even the most hardened Ministry loyalist might be expected to acknowledge a parent's suffering, if only privately. When Harry dreams of the attack on Arthur through the eyes of Nagini, and Dumbledore confirms its truth, the Weasley household erupts into crisis. Molly Weasley rushes to St. Mungo's, accompanied by Bill and the other children, save for those still at school. Rowling paints the hospital scene with tangible worry, showing Molly's tearful composure cracking when she sees her husband pale and bandaged. Fred and George hover protectively, Ginny clutches Harry's hand, and even Bill's usual calm is frayed. Percy, however, is absent, not only physically, but narratively. His absence is never explained beyond the pre-existing feud, leaving readers with an emotional void where a son's conflicted presence could have added complexity. In the earlier books, Percy's strained moments with his family were balanced with acts of quiet solidarity. In Prisoner of Azkaban, he fusses over Ron's new owl and lectures Ginny about her homework, the kind of small, almost parental attentions that suggest deep-seated care beneath his pretension. In Chamber of Secrets, when Ginny is taken into the chamber, Percy is visibly shaken, though embarrassed, by Harry discovering his own secret romance. These threads established Percy as someone who might argue fiercely over principles, but would still rally in the face of danger to a loved one. By erasing any such instinct in Order of the Phoenix, Rowling shifts Percy from flawed but redeemable to almost cold-blooded in his detachment. One might argue that the Ministry's propaganda had poisoned Percy's perception so thoroughly that he doubted the attack itself. But this stretches plausibility. The assault on Arthur was an official matter, an attack by a magical creature in a government-controlled facility, witnessed indirectly by Harry's connection to Voldemort. While Percy might have dismissed the details of the vision, he could hardly ignore the confirmed hospitalization of his own father, especially with St. Mungo's full of credible witnesses. His total silence reads less like in-universe stubbornness and more like an authorial decision to heighten the rift between Percy and the rest of the Weasleys. There is also the question of logistics. Percy works in the Ministry. Arthur's attack takes place in the Department of Mysteries corridor while he is on guard duty for the Order. News of such an incident would have rippled instantly through the Ministry offices. Even without Molly's personal owl or a sibling's flu call, Percy would have known. This knowledge makes his lack of action not merely an emotional failing, but a deliberate rejection of family bonds in favor of political allegiance. Yet Rowling does not offer even a sentence of internal justification or a Ministry-mandated gag order to explain his absence. Readers had come to understand Percy's ambition as rooted in a desire to prove himself beyond the shadow of his more eccentric or flamboyant brothers. His role as head boy, his attachment to his cauldron-bottom reporting Goblet of Fire, and his obsession with following rules all pointed to a young man who equated order with success. But family pride was always part of that framework. The Percy who gloated when Ron received a new wand from his parents, or who praised Bill's Gringotts work, was still tethered to the family unit. The Percy of Order of the Phoenix severs that tether so abruptly during Arthur's crisis that it risks breaking the believability of his arc. Some readers have speculated that Rowling intentionally wanted Percy's absence to feel cruel, as a narrative choice to make his eventual reconciliation in Deathly Hallows more emotionally potent. When Percy arrives at the Battle of Hogwarts, dramatically denouncing Pius Thicknesser and rejoining his family, the shock is intensified by the depth of the previous estrangement. However, the cost of this setup is the emotional realism of Order of the Phoenix. A more nuanced portrayal, perhaps a terse, awkward hospital visit or a reluctant letter to his mother, could have preserved Percy's dignity while still showing his political blindness. The Weasleys' grief over Arthur's injury is one of the more human moments in the series, cutting through the political intrigue and prophecy-heavy plot of Order of the Phoenix. Molly's stoicism cracks, the twins abandon their usual banter, and Harry feels the weight of being the conduit for the attack. Percy's absence casts a shadow over these scenes, not because he isn't physically there, but because the narrative offers no exploration of what he is thinking or feeling. The silence is deafening, and it is a silence the reader cannot quite reconcile with the Percy they thought they knew. Rowling's choice stands out more starkly because of how she handles other estranged relationships in the series. Take Sirius Black and his mother, Walburga Black. Despite their venomous history, Sirius cannot entirely detach from the memory of her. He rails against her portrait, he recounts her cruelty, but she remains part of his emotional landscape. With Percy, there is no such lingering thread during his feud with the family. The severance is so complete that even life-threatening injury cannot pierce it. This makes him feel less like a rounded human and more like a plot device designed to embody betrayal. Even the Slytherin characters, often positioned as more self-serving, are afforded moments of conflicted loyalty. Draco Malfoy, for instance, hesitates in Half-Blood Prince when given the direct task to kill Dumbledore, showing the internal war between his family's expectations and his own limits. Percy's omission in the hospital scene denies readers any such glimpse into turmoil. If there was a struggle between his ambition and his love for his father, it remains invisible on the page. The lack of explanation also leaves a thematic hole. The Order of the Phoenix is a book steeped in the cost of resistance, the fragility of alliances, and the way institutions can warp truth. Percy's arc could have served as a cautionary tale about the personal sacrifices made when aligning with corrupt authority, and it does to a point. But by erasing any visible trace of family concern, the story veers away from moral complexity and into the territory of villain caricature. Percy becomes not a misguided son, but a near parody of bureaucratic loyalty. One scene in particular underscores the missed opportunity. When Fred and George in the hospital waiting area make a grim joke to lighten Molly's mood, the narration notes how much they are struggling to keep their fear at bay. Imagine the tension if Percy had been present, stiff-backed in a ministry-approved suit, refusing to meet their eyes. The emotional stakes would have deepened, showing the fracture lines not only in ideology but in shared grief. Instead, the absence leaves the reader picturing Percy somewhere in the ministry, perhaps drafting memos, while his family braces for the worst without him. Percy's absence during Arthur's hospitalization has been defended by some fans as a deliberate mirror to familial estrangement in the real world, where deep political or personal divides can cause individuals to avoid even critical moments. While this may be true in life, fiction, especially in a series so attuned to the emotional beats of its characters, benefits from allowing the reader to witness such avoidance directly. Without that window, the act feels abrupt, bordering on unearned. Ultimately, Percy's behavior in Order of the Phoenix marks a sharp turn in his characterization, one that leaves readers wrestling with whether it is consistent or simply convenient for the plot. His silence during Arthur's brush with death is more than a gap in action. It is a missing piece of emotional logic that could have added depth to both his character and the Weasley family dynamic. It stands as one of those rare moments where Rowling's intricate web of relationships falters, leaving a crack that, for some readers, has never quite been sealed. Number 23, Umbridge's confiscated items. When Dolores Umbridge rose to the position of High Inquisitor, her power over Hogwarts became absolute in a way that startled even the most hardened staff members. She was suddenly free to impose restrictions, dismantle traditions, and confiscate possessions that, by all accounts, should have been well beyond her reach. The confiscations began quietly enough. A box of Weasley's Wizard Wheezes products from a group of third years, a trick deck of exploding snap cards from a jittery Hufflepuff. But it wasn't long before her authorities swelled to the point where she began seizing much more significant items. And among those items were things that, if one followed the logic established in earlier books, should never have left their owner's hands so easily. The most glaring example was the casual removal of students' broomsticks, an action that directly contradicted the enchanted safeguards J.K. Rowling herself had laid out in prior installments of the series. The broomsticks in question were not mere toys or novelties. For many students, they were expensive, highly personalized magical instruments, the equivalent of a wizard's sports car. In Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, Rowling had made a point of showing how seriously Hogwarts treated the storage and protection of these items. Madam Hooch, the school's flying instructor, had the authority to lock them away, using spells that we were told ensured their safety. Harry's own Nimbus 2000 had been safeguarded in such a manner during Quidditch season, and in Prisoner of Azkaban, his firebolt was kept from him for weeks under Professor McGonagall's orders. It was stated explicitly that the broom was stored in her office for examination, and that Harry could not access it without her permission. The implication was clear: these items were secure, bound by authority and enchantment. And yet, in Order of the Phoenix, we are told that Umbridge, a ministry official, not a staff member, skilled in Quidditch or flying instruction, confiscated Harry's broomstick along with those of Fred and George Weasley after the infamous Quidditch brawl with Draco Malfoy. There is no description of how she bypassed the protections, no mention of her obtaining assistance from Madam Hooch or Professor McGonagall. Instead, Rowling writes, Harry and George had no chance to appeal, as their brooms were summarily confiscated by Umbridge and locked away in her office. The act is presented as routine, almost administrative, as though the broomsticks were no more magical than a bag of marbles. The scene brushes past the fact that these were the very items the earlier books had treated as carefully guarded. This is where the inconsistency strikes hardest. Rowling's own world-building had already established that a broom could be secured against unauthorized use. In Prisoner of Azkaban, when Harry finally received his firebolt, the narrative made a point of telling us it had undergone thorough magical scrutiny. Such objects weren't simply lying around for anyone to take. They were watched, warded, and magically sealed. The absence of an explanation for Umbridge's sudden power to override these safeguards makes it feel as though the rules of the world were bent to serve the moment's drama, without concern for prior logic. A reader, especially one who had followed the details closely, could not help but wonder, did Umbridge possess some special authority over Hogwarts' magical protections? And if so, why was that never described? The problem deepens when we recall the nature of Umbridge's magical abilities as depicted elsewhere. She was not presented as an especially gifted witch in areas outside bureaucratic maneuvering and darkly creative punishments. Her defense spells were serviceable but unremarkable, her understanding of magical creatures limited to textbook theory, and her approach to teaching defense against the dark arts famously hollow. If anything, Rowling portrayed her as a mediocre practitioner whose true weapon was her ministry-backed authority. How, then, could she so effortlessly strip the fastest racing brooms in the school of their ownership and place them in her personal office without resistance? The moment becomes even more puzzling when contrasted with earlier incidents where broomstick security was explicitly a hurdle. When Harry lost his Nimbus 2000 after the Dementors' attack in Prisoner of Azkaban, the narrative described how it had been carried away by the Whomping Willow, torn apart before anyone could retrieve it. The destruction of the broom was a significant loss precisely because broomsticks were not replaceable on a whim. In Goblet of Fire, Even the top-tier models used in the Quidditch World Cup were treated with reverence, their owners fiercely protective. This sense of value and security makes Umbridge's nonchalant confiscation read less like a believable in-world event and more like a plot shortcut. There's also the matter of ownership. Hogwarts students did not receive their brooms from the school. They were personal property bought with family funds. The Weasleys' Clean Sweep Sevens and Harry's Firebolt were purchased with care and expense. One would imagine that in the wizarding world, magical law or tradition would prevent a headmistress, or even a High Inquisitor, from permanently taking possession of a student's personal magical equipment without due process. The fact that Rowling glosses over any legal or procedural pushback adds to the dissonance. Even when Argus Filch confiscated joke items in earlier books, they were stored in his office and sometimes returned at term's end. With the brooms, the suggestion is that Umbridge intended to keep them indefinitely, yet no mechanism of challenge is presented. If Rowling had taken a moment to frame Umbridge's seizure of the brooms as the result of a specific spell, a rare ministry-issued override charm, or even collusion with Madame Hooch, the scene could have preserved continuity. Instead, the confiscation is treated as an afterthought, a piece of stage dressing to emphasize Umbridge's growing control. It succeeds in that dramatic purpose, certainly, the loss of the brooms symbolizing the crushing of Harry's joy in Quidditch, but it does so at the expense of internal consistency. The attentive reader is left with the distinct sense that the rules changed because the plot demanded it. Another overlooked detail is the physical placement of the brooms afterward. Rowling tells us they were locked away in her office, which raises immediate questions. If Madame Hooch's storage spells were as secure as implied in Philosopher's Stone, how could Umbridge not only remove the brooms but also relocate them to a different part of the castle without interference? Did she dismantle existing enchantments? Did the spells only bind the brooms to Hogwarts grounds, not to a particular room? The text is silent on these points, and for a reader used to Rowling's usual knack for embedding magical logic into her world, that silence feels like an omission. The narrative also bypasses an opportunity for character-driven reaction. We are not shown Fred and George attempting to reclaim their brooms through magical trickery, nor Harry plotting to retrieve his firebolt despite the risk. This absence stands out because in earlier books, Rowling took care to depict the trio's resistance to unfair authority in practical, active terms. Here, they simply accept the loss, and the confiscation becomes a static fact in the background. It's as though the broomsticks themselves cease to matter once they're out of sight, a far cry from the emotional weight they carried in prior volumes. Some defenders of the scene might argue that Umbridge, by virtue of her position, had the power to compel Hogwarts' magical systems to yield to her will. After all, she was appointed by the Ministry and given unprecedented oversight of the school, but this interpretation still requires a leap the text does not support. Nowhere are we told that the Ministry maintains master keys to Hogwarts enchantments. In fact, Dumbledore's own autonomy as headmaster is often depicted as a bulwark against Ministry intrusion. That makes the ease with which Umbridge sweeps in and strips students of protected magical property even more incongruous. It is worth remembering, too, that Rowling delighted in planting seeds of magical lore and custom that would later pay off in the narrative. The trace on underage magic, the Fidelius charm, the unbreakable vow, all were given defined limits and consequences. The broom confiscation scene offers no such grounding. It relies entirely on the reader's willingness to accept Umbridge's growing tyranny without scrutinizing the mechanics of her actions. For casual readers, this might pass unnoticed, but for those engaged with the internal logic of the world, it leaves a gap. The irony is that Umbridge's confiscations could have been an opportunity to deepen her character and expand the lore of magical governance. A single paragraph explaining that the High Inquisitor's seal allowed her to override personal enchantments, or that she coerced the castle's magic into compliance, would have reinforced her menace while keeping faith with the established rules. Instead, the scene closes without elaboration, leaving the confiscated broomsticks as props rather than plot elements grounded in the series' own magical structure. What remains, then, is a moment that accomplishes its surface-level goal, showing Umbridge's petty vindictiveness and her capacity to rob students of joy, but does so by quietly stepping outside the boundaries Rowling herself had drawn. It is a small fracture in the carefully built edifice of Hogwarts' internal logic, but one that keen-eyed readers cannot help but notice. The image of Harry's firebolt, languishing in a locked office that by all rights should never have been able to hold it, becomes a symbol not only of his lost freedom, but of a rare lapse in the meticulous construction of the wizarding world. Number 24, posters of Sirius. The hunt for Sirius Black in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix is one of the Ministry of Magic's most heavily publicized campaigns, and yet it carries within it a curious flaw that becomes impossible to ignore when examined closely. In the book, the Ministry blankets the wizarding world with wanted posters bearing the face of Harry's godfather, warning the public of his supposed danger. The image they use is the same gaunt, grimacing photograph first shown in Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, the one taken during his days in Azkaban. That moment in Azkaban was striking. Sirius's hollow cheeks, wild hair, and haunted eyes filled the moving frame, giving the impression of a man both unhinged and desperate. Yet 2 years have passed since his escape, and much has changed. One would expect that the Ministry, with all its magical resources and constant surveillance measures, would have managed to acquire more recent images. The fact that they did not, and that Rowling presents the same photo as the Ministry's primary visual tool, creates a strange inconsistency in the otherwise richly detailed world. The problem is not that the Ministry cannot distribute images. In fact, Wizarding Society is rife with magical ways to capture and spread likenesses. Newspapers like the Daily Prophet frequently print moving photographs, from candid shots of Quidditch players mid-flight to quick captures of political events. In Order of the Phoenix, Harry himself becomes the subject of unflattering moving images in the Prophet, showing that the wizarding press is more than capable of obtaining updated visuals even without the subject's cooperation. This makes the decision to recycle a 2-year-old Azkaban mugshot for Sirius even more questionable. If we accept that the Ministry views him as one of the most dangerous fugitives alive, why settle for an outdated, possibly misleading likeness? The narrative in Prisoner of Azkaban takes care to emphasize the shock factor of Sirius's original wanted poster. Rowling writes of the sunken face of a man with long, matted hair, a gaunt, haunted look in his eyes, glaring from the photograph. That image was potent because it reflected the public perception of Sirius at the time, dangerous, deranged, and unpredictable. By Order of the Phoenix, however, Sirius's appearance has shifted. He is still thin and worn from his hardships, but his hair is cleaner, his features less hollow, and he moves differently. The Ministry's use of the same old image risks misrepresenting him to the public, which in turn would hinder their supposed goal of capturing him. Even in the Muggle world, police agencies regularly update wanted posters with newer photographs or artist renderings to account for changes in appearance. Rowling's decision to have the magical authorities fail to do so invites scrutiny. The wizarding world, unlike the Muggle one, has unique advantages for locating fugitives. There are spells to track magical signatures, enchanted cameras that can capture moving images at great distances, and even charms that can reconstruct a person's likeness from witness descriptions. We see hints of these abilities throughout the series. For example, Rita Skeeter's quick quotes quill and her habit of appearing exactly where the action is suggest that the magical press is adept at obtaining visuals of high-interest subjects. Given this, it is implausible that no one, neither the Daily Prophet nor Ministry surveillance teams, could secure a fresh image of Sirius during his supposed sightings across Britain. This gap in logic becomes even sharper when we remember the events between Prisoner of Azkaban and Order of the Phoenix. Sirius is known to have returned to Britain more than once, seen in the vicinity of Hogwarts and later at number 12, Grimmauld Place, his family home. The Ministry may not know of the latter location, but they have credible reports of his presence near school grounds. In Goblet of Fire, Harry sees Sirius's face in the flames of the Gryffindor common room fireplace, a method of communication that leaves a clear image. If this could be done by an ally, it stands to reason that some magical form of observation could have produced updated visuals for the authorities. Rowling's world-building typically handles these kinds of logistical details with care, so this oversight stands out. The same face staring from every poster in Order of the Phoenix feels less like a calculated move by the Ministry and more like an authorial shortcut, a way to signal instantly to readers that Sirius is being hunted without introducing a new visual for him. The repetition works for the audience's recognition, but it weakens the internal logic. After all, a poster that shows Sirius in Azkaban, thin, ragged, and in prison garb, would make him easier to disguise in real life. If he were walking the streets in better clothes, with a fuller face or shorter hair, he might not even be recognized. It is worth recalling the moment in Order of the Phoenix when Harry first notices the new wave of Sirius posters. Rowling describes the gaunt face of Sirius Black staring out from large posters pasted on walls, shop windows, and the sides of buses. The moving image snarls occasionally, an echo of the Azkaban days. Nowhere does the text suggest that these images have been updated or altered. The reader is meant to assume they are the same ones from years before. This is puzzling when we consider that the Ministry is deeply invested in painting Sirius as a constant, present threat. A newer, sharper image might have amplified public fear more effectively. Some might argue that the Ministry deliberately chose the Azkaban image because it fit their narrative of Sirius as a deranged criminal. The haunted, almost inhuman look of the mugshot conveys danger more viscerally than a cleaner, more recent photo might. By using an older image, they reinforce the public's memory of Sirius as he was portrayed in the days after his escape, mad, ruthless, and irredeemable. This reasoning could align with the Ministry's manipulative tactics seen elsewhere in the book, such as their smear campaign against Harry and Dumbledore. Yet this argument has weaknesses. If the primary goal is capture rather than propaganda, accuracy should outweigh dramatization. An updated likeness does not diminish fear, it strengthens the chance of recognition. There is also the issue of magical wanted posters themselves. Unlike Muggle posters, these images move and react, creating a far more vivid impression of the person in question. The idea that such an enchanted medium could not be refreshed with a newer moving image seems contradictory to everything else we know about wizarding media. The wizarding world, after all, is not bound by the limitations of film cameras and printing presses. The Ministry could, theoretically, replace the image in every poster with a single spell. That they did not suggests either a lapse in their investigative process or an intentional choice by the author not to complicate the visual continuity for readers. To further underscore the implausibility, we can compare Sirius's situation to that of other wanted individuals in the series. Fenrir Greyback, for example, appears on a wanted poster during the Second Wizarding War with an image that matches his known current appearance. Even smaller-time offenders in Half-Blood Prince and Deathly Hallows are depicted with up-to-date photographs or renderings. This pattern makes Sirius's static 2-year-old image an outlier, especially considering his notoriety. If we step outside the narrative for a moment, the reuse of the same image makes sense for the reader's memory. Readers instantly recognize the face from Prisoner of Azkaban without having to adjust to a new description. It's a simple storytelling tool that keeps Sirius's visual identity consistent. However, this decision sacrifices the realism of the Ministry's actions for the sake of reader convenience. The world Rowling built usually thrives on the illusion of reality. Small details about magical lore, economics, and culture make it feel lived in. Here, the illusion wavers. One could speculate that Rowling may have been subtly signaling the Ministry's incompetence, a theme that runs throughout Order of the Phoenix. Their failure to update Sirius's image could be read as another example of their bureaucratic ineptitude, similar to their refusal to accept Voldemort's return. But if that were the intent, it is never stated or hinted at in the text. Unlike other examples of Ministry failure, this one passes without comment, leaving it to readers to decide whether it is deliberate world-building or an unintentional oversight. Ultimately, this photographic inconsistency raises questions about the balance between narrative clarity and internal logic. Rowling's choice preserves a familiar visual for the audience, but undermines the believability of the Ministry's manhunt. The wizarding world is one where photographs move, magic can reconstruct faces, and newspapers can publish updated images almost instantly. In that context, the use of an outdated Azkaban mugshot becomes more than a minor detail. It is a crack in the seamless reality the series works so hard to create. What makes this detail even more intriguing is that it parallels certain real-world police practices where sensational images are kept in circulation long after they are accurate, simply because they fit a desired narrative. The Ministry's reuse of Sirius's photo may be an unintentional reflection of this, showing how propaganda can outweigh practicality. Still, whether by accident or design, it remains a jarring moment for attentive readers, one that invites both nitpicking and deeper analysis of the story's political machinery. And so, Sirius Black remains frozen in time on those magical posters, a haunted, snarling prisoner from 2 years ago, while the man himself moves in the shadows, changed and unrecognizable to those who believe they know his face. It is an image that worked once to shock the wizarding public, but in the later stages of the story, it stands as a quiet but telling inconsistency in Rowling's otherwise meticulous world. Number 25. The Moving Staircase. The stone steps of Hogwarts had always been portrayed as a living, breathing part of the castle's personality, enchanted, unpredictable, and, according to legend, utterly loyal to their own whims rather than to the schedules of young witches and wizards. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, this quirk of architecture is used in a moment that seems tailor-made to amplify suspense. Harry, Ron, and Hermione are rushing through the echoing corridors, robes flapping, heading toward a meeting of the Order. The air is tense with the secrecy of their mission, the shadows lengthening as they move. But just as they approach the staircase that should take them to their destination, the castle itself intervenes. Rowling writes, "The stair they had been climbing decided to move in the most inconvenient direction possible. The sudden shift swings them away from their intended landing, leaving them scrambling to find another route. It's a striking moment, one that underscores the idea that Hogwarts itself can be capricious, even obstructive, when it chooses. Yet as any attentive reader notices upon turning the pages, this whimsical trait seems oddly inconsistent. Earlier and later in the same book, the trio traverse the school with remarkable efficiency, covering great distances without once being sabotaged by a change of staircase direction. When Harry hurries from the Gryffindor common room to the library with Hermione to research educational decrees, for instance, the stairs carry them exactly where they need to go. When Ron rushes to the hospital wing after Fred and George's spectacular escape from Umbridge's wrath, the staircases remain obedient. There is no mention of treacherous swings or last-minute detours. In fact, in several pivotal scenes, such as when they sneak to Hogsmeade via the passage under the statue of the One-Eyed Witch, the castle's moving architecture seems to disappear entirely as an obstacle. The inconsistency becomes even more noticeable when we recall the very premise introduced in Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. There, Rowling establishes a clear image. There were 142 staircases at Hogwarts, wide, sweeping ones, narrow, rickety ones, some that led somewhere different on a Friday and others that vanished halfway up. The unpredictability is baked into the castle's identity, a feature that both delights and frustrates the students. If this principle is constant, then logically any scene set in the corridors should account for the possibility, or even likelihood, of an unexpected change. But in Order of the Phoenix, the effect seems to be switched on only when the story benefits from an added layer of urgency or frustration. The scene where the staircase thwarts them plays directly into the mood Rowling is building. The Order's meetings are shrouded in mystery, Harry's inclusion in them is contested by several adults, and the Ministry's interference looms over every hallway. The moving staircase here feels almost like an accomplice to Umbridge, slowing them down just enough to heighten the tension. The castle becomes a silent conspirator, guiding or misguiding its students according to some unseen logic. But when Harry and his friends are engaged in less plot-critical errands, the staircases behave like any mundane set of steps, docile and unchanging. The magic recedes into the background as though the enchantment itself knows when it's not needed for dramatic effect. This selective application of the staircase quirk creates a subtle fracture in the believability of the world. Hogwarts is a place where the fantastic is woven into every brick, where portraits wander between frames and suits of armor sing off-key during Christmas. The moving staircases are part of that same magical texture, and their unpredictability is supposed to be a constant truth. When that truth only emerges for narrative convenience, it can momentarily pull the reader out of the illusion, reminding them that events are ultimately shaped by an author's hand rather than by the natural rules of the world she's built. Consider the other moments in Order of the Phoenix, when the trio are under time pressure. After the infamous Quidditch ban, Harry storms back to the common room, anger radiating off him. It would have been an ideal moment for a staircase to intervene, either to slow his temper or to humorously mock his fury by swinging him toward an unwanted destination. But nothing of the sort happens. Similarly, when they are rushing to meet Dumbledore after the disastrous confrontation with Umbridge in her office, their route through the castle is uninterrupted. These absences make the earlier staircase incident feel less like an authentic moment in a living castle and more like a deliberate hurdle placed there for that scene alone.